October 14th, 2022, a crisp morning in the high country of the Sierra Nevada. Elias Thorne was not looking for ghosts. He was looking for a specific type of river stone, something smooth and weathered by centuries of glacial runoff to use for a memorial garden. He was 29 years old, and he was walking the same jagged ridgeline where his father, Thomas Thorne, had vanished 15 years prior. On September 12th, 2007, Thomas, a master angler and retired surveyor known for his meticulous nature, had set out for a solo 3-day excursion into the backcountry. He never returned. The search at the time had been exhaustive. Hundreds of volunteers, thermal imaging flights, and K9 units had scoured the granite basins. They found nothing. No scrap of fabric, no discarded tin, no footprint. The wilderness had simply opened its mouth and swallowed a man who knew its every contour. Now, 15 years later, the drought had receded the waterline of a nameless tarn, exposing a shelf of mud and shale that had been submerged for a generation. Elias saw a glint. It was not the dull gray of Riverstone. It was the matte orange of a ruggedized Garmin GPS map 60 CSX. The casing was cracked, the screen clouded by a decade and a half of silt and pressure, but the device was intact. It shouldn't have been there. It was 3 miles north of the last reported sighting and 2,000 feet above the lake Thomas was supposed to be fishing. This was the impossible discovery. The device was a brick of dead electronics, yet it held the final heartbeats of a lost journey. Elias took the device to a forensic data recovery specialist in Sacramento, a man who spent his days peering into the digital remains of tragedies. For weeks, the internal memory remained inaccessible. The salt and minerals had corroded the primary circuits, but the internal flash memory was encased in a proprietary silicone seal. On a Tuesday at 4:14 p.m., the screen flickered. The investigator didn't see a map at first. He saw coordinates. A line of digital breadcrumbs began to render on the monitor, stretching across a digital topography of 2007. The data was raw. It was haunting. It was a forensic image of a man's final hours. To understand the gravity of this data, one must understand Thomas Thorne. He was the expert victim. He didn't just carry a compass, he carried 3. He didn't just check the weather, he understood barometric pressure shifts. He was a man of systems. Yet, as the data populated, the systems appeared to have failed in a way that defied logic. The log begins at 6 a.m. on the day of the disappearance. The GPS shows Thomas at the trailhead. His movement is steady, 3 miles per hour, a veteran's pace. At 10:15 a.m., he reaches the primary creek. He stops for 12 minutes, likely a water break. Everything is mundane, everything is prepared. The silence of the mountain is reflected in the steady rhythmic pings of the satellite uplink. But then the movement changes. At 1:42 p.m., Thomas departs from the established trail. He turns west toward the vertical scree slopes of the Devil's Ladder. There is no water there. There is no fishable lake. There is only granite and thin air. The investigator watches the cursor on the screen. It moves with an eerie deliberation. Why would a master surveyor abandon the path? The metadata shows no signs of panic, no erratic bursts of speed, just a slow uphill crawl into the dead zone. Imagine you are standing on that slope in 2007. The air is thinning. The sun is a white disk in a bruised blue sky. You are Thomas Thorne, and you have every tool to save yourself. You have a satellite messenger. You have a topographical map. You have a lifetime of survival knowledge, and yet you are walking away from safety. The GPS shows him reaching the summit of the ridge at 5:19 p.m. The temperature would have been dropping toward freezing. The wind would have been a constant, abrasive roar. Instead of descending back to camp, Thomas stops. For 4 hours, the GPS remains stationary at the highest point of the ridge. No movement. The coordinates are fixed. In the world of search and rescue, this is known as a static event. It is the moment the narrative pauses. Was he injured? Was he watching something? At 9:22 p.m., in total darkness, the GPS moves again. But it doesn't move down. It moves along the razor edge of the ridge. It moves toward the tarn where Elias would find it 15 years later. The pacing of the pings becomes frantic. The intervals between satellite handshakes drop from 5 minutes to 30 seconds. The device is being held in a hand that is likely shaking. At 10:04 p.m., the path becomes a chaotic squiggle of GPS drift. This happens when a device is shielded by rock or when it is falling. The altitude reading drops 600 feet in less than 10 seconds. Then silence. The log ends. The void begins. For 15 years, that digital ghost lived in the mud, holding on to a truth that the physical world refused to yield. The son, Elias, sits in the sterile light of the lab, staring at the blue line on the screen. It is a map of his father's death, but it provides no comfort. It only provides questions. The mountains don't explain why a man of iron logic would walk into the dark. The mountains keep their secrets. The reconstruction of the narrative truth requires a forensic obsession with the mundane. We must look at the evidence log. When the recovery team finally returned to the tarn following the GPS coordinates, they found the backpack. It was wedged into a narrow crevice, protected from the worst of the elements. Inside were the artifacts of a life interrupted: one titanium cookpot, scorched but empty; one pair of high-altitude binoculars, the lenses shattered; one waterproof notebook with 3 pages torn out; one emergency whistle, its P frozen in place by decades of grit; and, most chillingly, a single topographic map with a circle drawn around a section of the mountain that was blank, a white space where the USGS survey hadn't completed the fine-line contouring. This was the irony of Thomas Thorne. His strength was his desire to map the unmappable. He wasn't lost, he was exploring a gap in the world, but the gap had teeth. The investigator notes the metadata on the final photos found on a separate digital camera in the pack. The images are overexposed. They show nothing but the gray-white of granite under a flash. Why use a flash in the open wilderness at night? You only use a flash when you are trying to see something that is right in front of your face, something that the moonlight cannot reach. At 10:02 p.m., 2 minutes before the GPS went over the edge, a photo was taken of the ground. It shows a series of depressions in the dust. They are not human, they are not animal, they are geometric. 5 perfectly circular holes, each 4 inches deep, arranged in a pentagon. There is no tool in a hiker's kit that makes such a mark. There is no geological process that explains it. The GPS shows Thomas was standing exactly where these marks were. He wasn't running from them. He was documenting them. He was being a surveyor until the very end. This is the burden of the grieving investigator: to look at a circle in the dirt and see the end of a father, to look at a GPS track and see a descent into madness or a climb into something else. The searchers in 2007 had walked right over this spot. Their thermal cameras had seen nothing because by the time they arrived, the heat of Thomas Thorne had already dissipated into the stone. He had become part of the mountain's cold storage. The son realizes that his father didn't disappear because he was unprepared. He disappeared because he found exactly what he was looking for. He found the edge of the map. And on the edge of the map, the rules of survival no longer apply. Imagine you are standing where he stood, looking at those 5 holes in the dirt. You have your GPS in your hand. You see the satellites connecting in the sky above. You feel the weight of your gear, the expert equipment that promises you safety. But as the wind picks up, you realize the gear is just plastic and metal. It has no power over the silence. The GPS track shows that in his final 60 seconds, Thomas Thorne didn't try to climb back up. He moved toward the edge of the cliff with a velocity that suggests he was pulled, or that he was stepping into a space he believed was solid. The final ping of the GPS is at 10:04:32 p.m. The altitude is recorded as 11,400 feet. The next ping, which never fully registered a satellite lock, was at 10,800 feet, a 600-foot vertical drop. No human survives that. Yet, when the forensic team analyzed the backpack, the straps weren't snapped. They were unbuckled, neatly, methodically. As if he had sat down, taken off his pack, set it in the crevice, and then— what? Why would he do this? Why would a man facing a lethal fall take the time to secure his equipment? The mountains don't explain why, they only provide the evidence of the act. The son holds the orange GPS, now a relic of a closed loop. He looks at the map of the 2007 wilderness and sees the blue line of his father's life ending in a cluster of pixels. It is justice through memory, but it is a cold justice. It is the realization that we are only as safe as the maps we trust, and sometimes the maps are wrong. The mountains keep their secrets, and sometimes they take the mappers too. This is the first layer of the void. The physical evidence is recovered, but the narrative truth remains buried under the silt of 15 years. We have the where and the when. We are still missing the why. The data recovery was not the end. It was the opening of a door into a specialized kind of nightmare. To analyze the second batch of evidence, the investigator had to employ a technique known as chronological layering. This involves overlaying the GPS coordinates with historical weather data, moon phases, and the logs of other hikers in the region from that specific week in September 2007. At 10:05 p.m., just seconds after the GPS went silent, a seismic station 40 miles away in Bishop recorded a localized microtremor. It was a sharp, high-frequency spike that lasted only 3 seconds. It didn't behave like a tectonic shift. It behaved like a collapse. But there were no rock slides reported in that basin. The sonar scans Elias commissioned of the tarn's floor revealed the next anomaly. Beneath 60 feet of frigid water and a decade of sediment, the drone's camera caught a shape that was too linear for nature. It was the rest of Thomas. He was not scattered. He was not broken by a 600-foot fall. He was resting on a ledge of silt, preserved by the near-freezing temperatures and the lack of oxygen at that depth. He was still wearing his high-visibility thermal jacket. The bright orange fabric had faded to a ghostly, translucent peach, but it served as a beacon in the dark. When the recovery divers finally brought the remains to the surface on October 28, 2022, the expert victim profile was reaffirmed. Thomas Thorne was still wearing his watch, a mechanical Breitling self-winding. It had stopped at 10:04, the exact second the GPS metadata recorded the drop. This synchronicity is a forensic rarity. It provides a definitive timestamp for the event, but it also deepens the irony. Thomas had spent his life measuring time and space with absolute precision, and in the end, time and space had converged to extinguish him. The coroner's report added a layer of impossible detail. There were no broken bones consistent with a fall from a great height, no blunt force trauma to the cranium, no shattered pelvis. The cause of death was listed as sudden cardiac arrest, likely triggered by extreme hypothermia or shock. But the lungs were dry. He hadn't drowned. He had died before he hit the water. Imagine you are falling through the black air of a Sierra night. You have 600 feet of gravity to contemplate the end. In that span of time, the human heart can do many things, but to simply stop mid-air without the impact being the cause suggests a level of terror that the mundane world rarely encounters. The grieving investigator, Elias, began to obsess over the third page. In the backpack, the waterproof notebook had 3 pages missing. They hadn't been rotted away by time. They had been surgically removed with a blade. In the side pocket of the pack, the forensic team found the knife. A Benchmade folder, the blade still locked open. There was no blood on it, only a trace amount of white crystalline residue. When analyzed, the residue was found to be a rare form of calcium carbonate, typically found in deep-sea thermal vents or high-altitude limestone caves. There is no limestone in that granite basin. The mountains keep their secrets, but they sometimes leave behind the wrong clues. Why would a man, seconds before his death, stop to cut pages from his journal? Why would he use his final moments of stability to censor his own record? The open loop grows wider. The investigator looks at the metadata of the GPS one more time, zooming in on the final 3 minutes. The drift shows that Thomas wasn't just walking, he was circling. He paced a tight 15-foot diameter circle for nearly 2 minutes. This is a behavior seen in animals caught in a fear loop or humans suffering from profound neurological interference. But Thomas was a surveyor. He didn't pace in circles, he plotted lines. The forensic casual explanation would be GPS bounce, where the signal reflects off canyon walls and creates a false path. But there are no walls on that ridge. It is an open, exposed spine of rock. The signal was clean. The movement was real. Imagine you are standing in that circle. The wind is biting through your layers. Your GPS is chirping in your hand, recording every frantic step. You are looking at the ground, at those 5 pentagonal holes, and you realize the map is no longer showing you the world you know. You are pacing because you are waiting for a door to open, or perhaps you are realizing that the door has already closed behind you. The son, Elias, begins to look into the journals of other surveyors from the 1970s, the men his father had trained under. He finds a recurring mention of the silent frequency. It was a piece of backcountry lore, a myth among the men who spent months alone in the high peaks. They spoke of certain dead zones where the compass needle didn't just spin, it dipped, where the air felt heavy, like it was saturated with water, even in a drought. Thomas had written a marginal note in one of these old texts. The map is not the territory has a mind. This is the rule of irony. The man who dedicated his life to the objective truth of geography had secretly been harboring a suspicion of the subjective impossible. He had prepared for the cold, the hunger, and the terrain. He had not prepared for the territory to wake up. At 10:01 p.m., the GPS recorded a temperature drop of 20 degrees in 60 seconds. No weather pattern on Earth explains this. It is a thermodynamic impossibility in that environment. It suggests that the microtremor and the temperature drop were part of the same localized event. Thomas Thorne was not in the Sierra Nevada anymore. He was in a pocket of reality that was being physically squeezed. The reconstruction of the narrative truth now moves into the phase of the unseen witness. There was another hiker in the area that night, 3 miles to the south, a solo trekker named Sarah Jenkins. In her 2007 statement to the police, which had been dismissed as stress-induced hallucination, she claimed she saw a blue pillar of light rise from the northern ridge at approximately 10 p.m. She described it as silent, flickering like a dying fluorescent bulb, and then vanishing into a pinprick. The investigator overlays Sarah's sighting with Thomas's GPS track. The blue pillar would have been standing exactly on the coordinates of the pentagonal holes. Thomas wasn't just documenting the holes, he was standing inside the light. Why would he stay? Why would a man trained in the hazards of the wild not run from a phenomenon that defied the laws of physics? Perhaps because to a surveyor the unknown is not a threat, it is an assignment. He was a man of high-gravity curiosity. He stayed to measure the light, and the light measured him back. The evidence log continues to haunt the son. Among the recovered items was a small digital voice recorder. It had been in the inner pocket of the jacket, protected by the body of the man himself. The electronics were fried, but the solid-state memory chip was salvaged. There is only one file on it. It is 42 seconds long. It was recorded at 10:03 p.m. The audio is mostly the roar of high-altitude wind, a white noise that threatens to swallow everything. But underneath the wind there is a sound like grinding metal, and then the voice of Thomas Thorne. He is not screaming, he is not crying. He is speaking in the flat, detached tone of a man dictating a report. The coordinates are shifting, he says. The granite is soft. It feels like memory. Then a sharp metallic click, the sound of the Benchmade knife opening. I have to leave the pages. They won't understand the map. Then the sound of paper tearing, 3 times. The wind surges, a scream of air that peaks the microphone, and the recording cuts to digital silence. This is the open loop that breaks the sun. His father's final words weren't a goodbye. They were a professional observation of a reality that was dissolving. The mountains don't explain why a man would prioritize the map over his life. They keep their secrets in the form of torn paper and dry-lunged corpses. Elias looks at the empty spaces in the notebook and realizes the justice through memory he sought is a jagged, uncomfortable thing. He has found his father's body, but he has lost the man. The man was replaced by the expert victim, a servant to a mystery that required his silence. Imagine you are the investigator now, 15 years later. You have the GPS, the watch, the recorder, and the body. You have more evidence than any other cold case in California history, and yet the more you know, the less you understand. You are standing on the edge of the same cliff metaphorically, looking down into the silt where the truth is supposed to be. But the truth isn't in the water. It's in the white space on the map. It's in the 3 pages that are gone. Why would he hide the truth from us? The question echoes through the lab, through the sun's mind, and out into the granite basins of the Sierra. The mountains don't answer. They just wait for the next surveyor. The pacing of the revelation slows here. We must sit with the artifacts. We must look at the macro shots of the rust on the GPS buttons. We must see the moss that had begun to grow on the thermal jacket's zipper. These are the physical markers of the passage of time, the mundane armor that failed to protect the soul within. The investigator realizes that the impossible discovery wasn't the GPS. It was the fact that Thomas Thorne wanted to be found, but only after the world had changed enough to maybe, just maybe, believe him. We are now moving into the final reconstruction, where the forensic and the philosophical collide. The son prepares to return to the ridge, not to find more evidence, but to stand where the circles were. He needs to know if the frequency is still there. He needs to know if the map is still being written. The return to the ridge in November 2022 was not a search for closure, but a search for the signal. Elias Thorne arrived at the coordinates 37.2592 degrees north, 118.6651 degrees west, at exactly 9:45 p.m. The air was a razor, the same temperature his father would have felt in those final minutes of 2007. The grieving investigator had become the participant. He stood where the pentagonal holes had been recorded, though 15 years of erosion and snowpack had smoothed the granite back into its natural indifferent state. He carried a modern magnetometer and a high-frequency receiver, tools his father didn't have. He was looking for the silent frequency. At 10:01 p.m., the timestamp of the historical temperature drop, Elias's digital thermometer plummeted from 18 degrees Fahrenheit to -4 degrees Fahrenheit in less than 30 seconds. The battery on his primary flashlight, rated for 10 hours of sub-zero use, flickered and died. The silence was absolute. No wind, no nocturnal movement, just the sound of his own blood pumping in his ears. This is the moment where the expert victim profile merges with the present. Like his father, Elias did not run. He watched the magnetometer. The needle didn't just swing, it vibrated with such intensity that the casing began to hum. The narrative truth was no longer a story about a fisherman who fell into a lake. It was a story about a geological anchor point, a place where the metadata of the universe was being rewritten. The investigator's proxy, the sun, realized that the 3 torn pages were not a loss, they were a breadcrumb. In the side pocket of the recovered backpack hidden beneath the lining, the forensic team had missed a small laminated card. It wasn't a map. It was a calibration chart for a surveying tool that hadn't been manufactured since the 1960s. On the back, in his father's steady drafting hand script, was a single sentence. The frequency is not a sound, it is a weight. Imagine you are Elias standing in that sudden, impossible cold. You feel a pressure on your chest, not of air, but of presence. You look down at your own feet, and for a split second, the granite under your boots looks translucent, like deep ice. You realize why Thomas stayed. He wasn't trapped by the light. He was fascinated by the architecture of it. He was a surveyor who had finally found something that didn't fit into a grid. At 10:04 p.m., the exact minute of the event, Elias's receiver caught a burst of static. He recorded it. When he later slowed the audio down by 800%, he didn't find words. He found a rhythmic pulse that matched the human heart at a resting state, 60 beats per minute. The mountain was mimicking the biology of the man it had taken. This is the rhetorical echo. The mountains don't explain why they mirror us. They just reflect our own mortality back in frequencies we can't understand. The evidence log now includes Elias's own findings, a secondary layer of data that validates the primary tragedy. The forensic reconstruction suggests that Thomas Thorne didn't fall, he was unanchored. When the temperature dropped and the microtremor occurred, the physical properties of the ridge altered. The granite is soft comment from the recorder was a literal observation. He didn't drop 600 feet through the air, he moved through the mountain itself. The drift on the GPS wasn't a malfunction, it was the device trying to calculate a position in a space that was no longer three-dimensional. Why would he leave the backpack? The answer is the final irony of the expert. He knew the backpack, with its metal frames and electronic signatures, was an anchor to the world he was leaving. He unbuckled it to see if he could float. He unbuckled it to be light enough for the transition. The open loop of the unbuckled straps is finally closed by a terrifying logic. It wasn't a gesture of surrender. It was a final experiment. The sun leaves the ridge at midnight, his equipment drained of power, his mind filled with a heavy, cold clarity. He realizes that justice through memory in this case means accepting that some disappearances are not crimes and they are not accidents. They are selections. The mountain chose Thomas Thorne because he was the only one who would appreciate the precision of the process. The forensic casual lens reveals that the calcium carbonate on the knife was indeed from a different environment, one that exists miles beneath the crust. The knife had traveled where the man had gone, and then somehow it had come back. Or perhaps it had never left. Perhaps the tarn and the ridge are the same point in a folded map. The mountains keep their secrets, but they leave the equipment behind to mock our need for answers. The investigator sits in his home office surrounded by the artifacts, the orange GPS, the Breitling watch, the faded jacket. He looks at the macro shots of the rust and sees not decay, but a slow-motion transformation. The man is gone, the body is recovered, but the why has migrated from the father to the son. The moral warning is clear to any who would enter the high country with a map and a sense of certainty. The map is a contract with reality, and reality can be renegotiated without your consent. Imagine you are looking at your own GPS right now. The little blue triangle shows exactly where you are, but what if the triangle starts to circle? What if the altitude starts to climb while your feet stay on the ground? Would you run or would you reach for your recorder? The documentary essayist concludes that the case of Thomas Thorne is closed in the eyes of the law, but it remains wide open in the eyes of the wilderness. The sun will return every year on September 12th, not to mourn, but to check the calibration of the world. He knows now that the expert is the one who knows when to stop measuring and start watching. The pacing of the story ends here, in the static-filled silence of an archival tape. No trace, just the frequency. The mountains don't explain why they need us to watch them. They just wait for the light to turn blue. We are left with the image of the tarn, the water still and dark, holding the memory of a man who walked through stone. The forensic image is complete, but the narrative truth is a ghost that refuses to be caught. The final ping has been recorded, the log is shut, the void remains. Why would he do this? Because he was a surveyor and he found the end of the world. The final layer of the forensic reveal is the narrative truth, the phase where the investigator stops looking at the data and begins to look at the silence. The mystery of Thomas Thorne concluded not with the discovery of what happened, but with a realization of what he had become. The 8,000-word analysis of his final path reveals a pattern that the grieving investigator calls the geometric descent. It is the observation that Thomas's movements in his final 20 minutes formed a perfect logarithmic spiral, a shape found in galaxies and seashells, but never in the trekking patterns of a rational man. At 10:04 p.m., as the watch stopped and the GPS plummeted, Thomas was not at the end of his journey. He was at the center of the spiral. The evidence log ends with an item that was recovered not from the tarn, but from the pocket of the faded thermal jacket 6 months after the body was surfaced. It was a small, smooth piece of granite, no larger than a coin. When the forensic lab sliced the stone into thin sections for microscopic analysis, they found something that should not exist. Entrapped within the crystalline structure of the stone, granite formed millions of years ago, was a fragment of modern synthetic fiber, specifically a thread of orange nylon matching the 2007 jacket. This is the ultimate impossible discovery. It suggests a molecular entanglement that defies the linear progression of time. It suggests that Thomas Thorne didn't just fall into the mountain, he was integrated into it. The rule of irony is here at its most cruel. The surveyor who sought to define the land was literally absorbed by his subject. Imagine you are standing in the Sacramento lab, looking through the microscope at that orange thread trapped in ancient stone. You realize that the expert victim didn't fail to survive. He succeeded in becoming permanent. The mountains don't explain why they choose certain individuals for this synthesis. Perhaps it is a matter of frequency. Perhaps it is a matter of being the only witness present when the white space on the map opens up. The grieving investigator, Elias, finally understands the torn pages. His father wasn't censoring the truth from the world. He was protecting the world from the truth. The pages likely contain the coordinates of the folding points, the places where the granite becomes soft and the temperature drops. To leave that map behind would be to invite others into the void. Thomas Thorne died a hero of silence, taking the instructions for the impossible with him into the dark. The open loop of his life is not meant to be closed. It is a warning. The pacing of the narrative finally reaches its static end. We see a macro shot of the sun's hand resting on the weathered GPS. We see the flashbulb transition to a final archival photo of Thomas Thorne in 1998, standing on a summit, his transit level set up, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He looks like a man who knows that the horizon is a lie. The forensic essayist concludes that we search for the lost not to bring them back, but to ensure they haven't found something that might follow us home. The mountains keep their secrets because the secrets are too heavy for the valley. We end with the moral warning: respect the white space on the map. Do not seek the silent frequency, because once you hear it, you can never go back to the mundane world of trails and tides. You become a coordinate. You become a ghost in the flash memory. You become part of the mountain's long cold memory. The case of the fisherman vanished is now a closed file, but the mountain is still there, vibrating at 60 beats per minute, waiting for the next surveyor to walk off the edge of the world. No signal, no trace, just the stone, just the silence. The mountains don't explain why, they just are. The forensic analysis of the Thorne disappearance reached its terminal phase not in the mountains, but in the sterile quiet of a digital forensics lab in late 2024. The investigator had moved beyond the physical artifacts of the GPS and the watch, turning instead to the metadata of the atmosphere. By synchronized plotting of the GPS drift against the micro-tremor recorded in 2007, a new granular detail emerged. At 10:03:15 p.m., 60 seconds before the terminal drop, the GPS recorded an altitude of 12,400 feet. This was impossible. The ridge itself only reached 11,400 feet. For 45 seconds, Thomas Thorne was walking on a plane of existence that was 1,000 feet above the physical Earth. This is the ghost elevation phenomenon, a forensic anomaly where the device remains functional but the coordinates suggest the user is suspended in open air. Imagine you are Thomas Thorne. You are not falling, you are not climbing. You are walking on a surface that your eyes cannot see but your GPS can feel. The narrative truth suggests that the pentagonal holes in the dirt were not imprints of a craft, but anchors. They were the points where the higher elevation had pinned itself to the granite. The evidence log was updated one final time when Elias returned to his father's old surveying office. In a locked floor safe, he found a field journal from 1992. In it, Thomas had sketched a topographical map of the same ridge, but the contour lines were drawn in a spiral. Underneath, a single note: "The mountain is folding. I can see the seam." This was the expert's secret. Thomas hadn't stumbled into a trap in 2007. He had been stalking a geological event for 15 years. He was the grieving investigator of his own future tragedy. The pacing of this discovery is a slow-burn realization of intent. Thomas Thorne didn't go fishing. He went to the seam. The rule of irony dictates that his greatest tool, his surveyor's precision, was exactly what led him to the place where precision dies. The impossible discovery was ultimately the man's own desire to be part of the map. When the forensic team analyzed the synthetic fiber trapped in the ancient stone, they found that the fiber wasn't just matching the jacket, it was grown into the quartz. The mountain hadn't just crushed him, it had adopted his molecular structure. The open loop question remains, why would he leave the recording? Why let us hear the sound of the knife? The answer is the moral warning. The sound of the knife was not an act of survival, but an act of severance. He was cutting himself away from our reality. He was unbuckling the pack and cutting the pages because he knew that if he brought the evidence of the other side back to us, the seam would never close. He sacrificed his life to remain a mystery, protecting the valley from the high-gravity truth of the peaks. The mountains keep their secrets because men like Thomas Thorne choose to keep them. The final visual cue is a slow pan over the orange GPS, now sitting in a museum-grade display case in Elias's home. The screen is dark, but at exactly 10:04 p.m. Every night, the internal clock, powered by nothing, flickers for a single second. It shows the coordinates of the tarn. It shows the ghost elevation. It shows that Thomas is still walking. Imagine you are standing on that ridge now. The air is cold, your watch is ticking. You look at the ground and see 5 circles in the dust. You have a choice. You can follow the trail back to the valley, back to the mundane, back to the safety of the known, or you can look up, where the GPS says there is ground and the sky says there is nothing. The mountains don't explain why they choose the curious. They just wait for the surveyor to step off the map. No signal, no trace, just the spiral. The log is finished. The reconstruction is complete. Justice through memory has been served. But the memory is a haunting, heavy thing. The mountains keep their secrets, and now so do we.